Good morning or afternoon. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for W&M Environmental, a division of Braun Intertech, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on air construction permits at Clever Fundamentals. Our experts for today are Sally Perry and Vanessa Coleman. Ladies, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them to me through the chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your questions, which hardly ever happens, but I will make sure that Vanessa and Sally sees them and we get an answer you to as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon, along with the slides, and I will send you an email with the link when they're made available. But I wanted to let everybody know that we are broadcasting this webinar. Each of us are at our homes, and this will be kind of like the first time ever. So there's a good chance you might hear a dog bark in the background. There's a good chance that you'll hear a lawnmower, or there's a good chance that my cat could jump on the table and end this broadcast at any time. So just want to give you everybody a heads up, and we are doing the best we can. So let's get started. So welcome to our webinar. So if we want to go to the next slide, I would introduce you to our presenters.
Hey, Lance. We've got some technical difficulties already.
Oh boy.
Do you have any capabilities of advancing the slides?
Friend? I do not, because Vanessa is in control of the.
Yeah, she got kicked off.
Well, let's give her a few minutes. Maybe she'll get back on. So, anyway,
yeah, you can go ahead and.
How are things?
Maybe.
Houston.
Yeah, Houston's good. It's stay-at-home orders, and that's what I'm able to do. So I will be at home with a potential barking dog in the background.
Okay, well, yes, it's always fun. So, it's funny just being at home and in our backyards, and not with the outside world. It doesn't seem like anything's really going on until you turn on the news and you see all the craziness. But
yeah,
I see Vanessa's back on, but I have.
Yeah, she says she can't hear anything. Oh, okay, there she is.
Okay, I think I'm good. I'm going to check if I can advance the slide, but I cannot. Am I still the presenter, Lance?
Yeah, let me see here. It shows.
It looks like it.
But let me try one other thing. Because now,
sorry, everyone.
Now I show you moments. So let's try that. Oh, now it says presenter Amanda Grams. I don't know who that is.
One of the attendees.
Well,
don't worry, Amanda. You don't have to present.
Well, she might be doing a better job than we are right now. So let's see. Let me try one more time here. Okay.
Okay, let me ready to show my screen.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, now to just get it in presentation mode. Oh, I see what's going on here. It is in my other screen. Nuggets.
There we go.
Good.
All right, we're back in business.
Hey.
Okay. So let me go to the previous slide. Okay, there you go.
Okay, and the good part is this was all recorded, so you guys can listen to this over and over and over on our lack of continuity. So, okay, so let's introduce to our presenters. I guess the first slide. Okay, there's Vanessa. Yay! So Vanessa is our senior engineer at compliance and permitting in our South region. She has a BE in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Detroit. She has over 12 years experience in the environmental compliance for the industrial sector, and her experience includes program development, implementation, management, as well as multimedia permitting and compliance. So did I get everything? Is there anything that you wanted to add to that, Vanessa?
No, I think we're good.
Right. So the next is Sally Perry, And Sally is our senior scientist and group manager in our compliance and permitting in the South region. She has a BS in Earth Systems from Stanford University. She has over 10 years of experience in environmental permitting and compliance for the industrial sector, and her experience includes multimedia permitting and compliance in multimedia, such as air, water, waste, spill prevention, and chemical reporting. Did you want to add anything to that, Sally?
That's me. I'm here in the Houston office for Braun W&M, and
that's right.
Excited to be here.
Vanessa is actually in our San Antonio office as well. So here's our agenda. Sally, you were going to go
all over the place. Yeah. So I'll jump right in, and we'll try and keep a lot of this brief. We think we're going to spend the majority of our time, if we can, on examples. I feel like that's a little more beneficial for the audience typically. And if there's something that we breeze through a little too quickly for anyone, feel free to speak up during the question and answer portion of the webinar, and we can address your questions. So we'll start out by talking about some essentials and what we are and what we're not covering. The intent of this webinar is to start on some basics and introduce a lot of unfamiliar staff and faces with air permitting, and I guess I'll just call it air permitting as a general term for an authorization or registration or a permit that we can get to authorize our sources. We'll get into that later. Construction triggers, so what and when do you do, what do you do, when do you do activities, actions to air permit, what is considered construction, and when you are permitting, what should you consider, what are different goals and objectives that you might have, what are additional regulations, what are your sources that you need to look into to determine when you permit, what you permit, timing, etc. And then we'll go through several scenarios to give you an idea of some tricky topics that can be made simple when you back up and think about it. So we'll get to it. So some essentials, way backing up, why do we do this? Who and what are we really protecting here? So it's same with any environmental media, waste, water, even remediation. We are trying to protect human health in the environment outside of the operation or the source or the process or the facility. And so some of those, the main ones include smog, acid rain, and health hazards that we want to prevent. So the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, implemented the Clean Air Act, CAA. And as part of that, they have the NAAQS that they've developed. Those are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And those are limits on atmospheric concentrations of criteria pollutants that will cause those health hazards, the smog, the acid rain that EPA developed, implemented in the Clean Air Act, region by region, to help us ensure that we are being protective of human health. And those criteria pollutants that we primarily look to that are part of the NAAQS are NOx, CO, PM, SO2, ozone, and lead. And ozone is kind of a marker for VOCs that we use, volatile organic compounds, because VOCs and NOx form ozone. There are additional pollutants that we would look at depending on the situation, depending on the process, what is being emitted. We want to make sure that anything emitted is being protective of these things and not causing smog, acid rain, or health hazards. So what emits these criteria pollutants, these air pollutants? They're sources, as we call them. So we want to identify and quantify these sources that emit these pollutants so we can be protective of human health. And so what is a source? And a little bit of that depends on where you're located, what your regulation, how your regulations define things. So I'll start out by saying always look to definitions when you're reading a regulation across the board for anything environmental related. Look to your definitions to see how your region, your authority defines different words. So source, facility, unit, process, they're all kind of utilized throughout regulations, and particularly in Texas, we see that a lot. The difference between a source or a facility and what are they exactly. We might say that a source, and this is how it's defined, is a point of origin of air contaminants. And then a facility is a structure or something discrete, piece of equipment, an enclosure, a building that contains a stationary source. So once you have identified or defined what your source is, does it emit air contaminants? And a lot of the times for any industrial facility, the answer is going to be yes. And it can get a little bit tricky, or maybe your brain just doesn't make that connection necessarily, but that's the important part, is defining what your facility is, what your source is, and then is it emitting anything or has the potential to emit anything into the air. Some really basic examples could be things that are a little more tricky, maybe metal treating. So if you have a facility that maybe you have a series of baths where you put some sort of chemical into those baths, maybe it's heated, maybe those chemicals that are in the water might get into the air. And we want to consider that process as a source that emits air contaminants. Piping components, maybe you have a facility where you transfer some sort of gas from one place to another. In theory, you don't want to lose any product throughout that piping system, but in practice, they most likely leak at the connectors, at the flanges, at the valves, and those would be considered a source of air contaminants. Surface coating, I like to think of it smaller examples of maybe you're just doing some maintenance work, some touch up on some products, some painting of some tanks. Still, that paint, those coatings emit air contaminants, even if that surface coating material, that paint, is low VOC or water-based. We still want to consider it and evaluate it. So those are some basics about sources. And now your state, your region has implemented some regulations that require you to get an air authorization or a permit or a registration of the like, put that in place to ensure that those sources that you're operating, that you wish to construct, meet the NACs. And so that's why we need to authorize these sources. They have emissions, and we want to prevent any health hazards, smog, acid rain.
Sally, is the regulations in state by state relatively close to the same, or are there different, variables from state to state? Or?
I'd say that air is one of the media that gets a little bit more complex state to state, region to region. Each state does a little bit differently. Texas, for example, has one regulatory authority, TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that is the authority. However, other states like California will have it split up regionally: Bay Area, South Coast, San Joaquin, and then each of those will even do it a little bit differently. But it's all based on the federal regulations just promulgated to the state agencies, but they do tend to be a little bit different state to state, but these big essential concepts are mostly the same.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Yeah. So then moving on to the next slide. Is Vanessa still there?
Oh, yes. Is it not showing? It is
sorry, mine was lagging. Got it.
Okay.
I got it now. So I mentioned that now we know we need to get some sort of permit so we can keep everyone safe. And there's kind of two worlds of permits: NSR and Title V. NSR is New Source Review, and the purpose of New Source Review is to maintain those NACs in your area. And we use the words attainment and non-attainment to identify if your county or your region, sometimes it's defined regionally, is meeting those NACs. If you're meeting them, your New Source Review is intended to help your region keep meeting those standards. If you're not meeting them, the New Source Review is there to help you get back into attainment, help you meet those NACs. And so what it's going to do is it's going to authorize the construction of your source or your process or your facility, whether it be a new source or a modification to an existing source or facility. It's going to authorize the construction and the associated emissions. And this is something that needs to be completed first. This needs to be in place for the most part, with some caveats and special permits before construction begins. And construction, will go into how that's defined in a little bit, but it's putting the source in place, putting any foundations in place, buildings. And then new source review is different from Title V, because what Title V is going to do is it's going to consolidate all of your permitting requirements. If you're a major source, if you have to have a Title V, it's going to consolidate that all into one permit. And it ends up being a little bit of a handy tool, even because it has everything you need to do for your facility, for every single source and process of your facility, all in one place, into one enforceable permit. And what the Title V is really doing is it's authorizing the operations at the site. You had the new source review section to authorize the construction. Now you need Title V to authorize your operations if you're a major source, if you fall into the category of Title V. And the timing is more about prior to operations. For your initial application and subsequent revisions, operations must begin prior to issuance. Two different worlds. So again, like what you had mentioned earlier, Lance, or asked about, is how do different states do things? Is it mostly similar across the board? Here's an example where there are some differences on how each state or region chooses to do it. Many states do a two-permit system. So before construction, you get your new source review permit in place, and then prior to operation, you get a separate Title V. It's a two-permit system. So then you, moving forward, have to comply with both your NSR and your Title V.
Sally, is there
Other states?
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Is there different levels of construction? I mean, if you're building something, you automatically need an air permit, or is there different levels? Like if I'm going to be building something industrial, or if I'm just building a building downtown somewhere, is there a difference in the two?
It really boils down to those essentials on if you're constructing a source of air contaminant. So if in that building that you're building downtown, if you're putting in any sort of source that has a potential to emit an air contaminant, it could be a boiler, it could be an engine, then you likely would need to evaluate what type of authorization mechanism that you'd need. So it couldn't be anything at all. It could be very minor, and in which case you might just need a very minor permit, but it would still need to be evaluated. Yeah. We'll go back real second. The two-permit system, I'll breeze through it really quick. So again, some states have two permits, some states, they combine them into one. So if you're new source review, you start off that way, you get a construction permit, or to get that permit, you start construction, you start operations, maybe you add something and it triggers a need to move to a Title V permit. You're going to scrap your NSR permit and you're going to get a whole new permit, Title V, that combines everything into one, and you just would have one permit covering everything. So important to know that there are differences state to state or region to region. All right.
So what constitutes as new construction? So a lot of times when you're either thinking about beginning a new project or thinking about building a greenfield, the question often comes up of what constitutes as construction. For a new facility, as Sally mentioned earlier, a facility is a discrete or identifiable structure, device, item, equipment, or enclosure that constitutes or contains a stationary source, including apparatuses other than emission control equipment. This is pretty obvious when you're starting from scratch. It's when, it's totally new. What isn't as clear is when you're thinking about modifying an existing facility. What constitutes construction is any physical change, any change in the method of operation of the facility that either increases the amount of an air contaminant emitted, results in the emission of an air contaminant not previously emitted. If you change the method of pollution control, if the character of emissions change, or if the increase in actual emissions or emissions allowed to be emitted by the permit or quote unquote allowable. We'll get to some examples where it kind of makes it a little more clear, this breakdown of modifications. Oh, sorry, here's one. A company is replacing a boiler with an identical boiler. Is that considered construction? Yes. Maybe you're deciding to change the chemicals used in a scrubber. Can that trigger a modification? More than likely, it can, the chemistry is changing, so it can trigger a modification. You are routing an existing oven exhaust that was not previously controlled to an existing scrubber because throughput is going to increase. Yes, several reasons. You are now changing the method of control, but then also increasing throughput. You are moving an existing blast booth to a new location inside the same building and adding new blast equipment. Kind of depends on how it's permitted, but ultimately you are potentially increasing the throughput by adding the blast equipment. So yes, this is going to trigger a modification. Lastly, adhesive is used in an adhesive machine and the company wants to switch to a stronger adhesive to improve quality. This is another depends on how it's currently authorized. And we'll get to that real quick of what I mean about that. As a side note, in Texas, I'm referencing the Texas language here, but every state has very similar language about permit amendments and authorization representations. So I'm going to read it. All representations with regard to construction plans and operation procedures in an application for a permit, as well as any general and special provisions attached to the permit itself, become conditions upon which the subsequent permits are issued. It shall be unlawful for any person to vary from such representations or permit provisions. If the change will cause a change in the method of control of emissions, the character of emissions, or result in an increase in the discharge of the various emissions, unless the application is to amend the permit and such amendment is approved. Ultimately, the permitted facility should be constructed and operated as represented in the application. There's a high likelihood most deviations from what was represented in the permit would require a modification. And just another reminder, a permit application is just as important as the permit itself. So if we go back to the question of a company wants to switch to a stronger adhesive to improve quality, would that trigger a modification? Potentially. We would have to look at what was previously represented. First, what's the current permit mechanism? And how was that represented? If it was, let's say this is a de minimis source, when we went through, when the facility goes through and determines if something is applicable, what type of adhesive did they use to come to the determination? So at that point, you would kind of compare what was used to represent and then where you want to go. If it is a larger permit, if it's an NSR permit, you look at what was included in what was used to calculate your emission, which SDS was used, which content, which adhesive content was used to calculate. And if it falls below, then, and you're using worst case, then maybe it doesn't trigger a modification. If you did not use worst case and use very specific adhesive information, then yeah, maybe it would require a modification. So just to bring back the point, super important to keep any kind of applicability determinations and representations and permit applications in your file along with the permit itself, because it contains a lot of information of how that authorization was derived. An NSR permit is required before construction or modification of a facility begins. Construction, kind of to Lance's point, is, is this just a building? And we need to define construction. Construction is anything other than site clearance or site prep. Land clearing, soil load bearing tests, leveling of the area, sewer and utility lines, road building, power line installation, fencing, construction, shack building, etc. However, once soil and site are ready for foundations, the first excavation into the readied soil is considered construction for air authorization purposes. Equipment can be stored on site. However, no attempt should be made to assemble the equipment or to connect the equipment into any electrical, plumbing, or other utility systems, because this would constitute as construction. Excavation, form erection, or steel laying pertaining to foundations upon which a permit will rest is also considered construction. Construction foundations not required, no problem. Earthen dams, placement of pilings, soil stabilization, storage tank fills, or retaining structures also equals construction. Want to reiterate the construction, because I know when I was in industry and management would come and say, hey, we're thinking about doing XYZ, we already started clearing and we're getting ready to order the equipment. It should be here in 2 weeks. Like, hold up. Now we're getting into potentially construction, and we haven't even started the permitting process or even the applicability determination to see how this all fits. So this goes back to the point of timing is very important. All these things work together when we're determining what is the best authorization mechanism and considerations. Yes.
Here's a question I have. So let's say that you're redesignating the use of a building that you already have, and you're putting in something, let's say like a change of boiler. That would be considered new construction. So that could totally change the air permit that you may need.
Potentially.
Or if you're putting one in and you didn't have one before.
For sure.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. Definitely.
All right. So other things to consider when you're looking to permit authorize your construction. Timing, we kind of alluded to this a little bit with the construction example that Vanessa gave, but think about how long it'll take to complete the permitting activity, actions, get it completely authorized, or whatever is required for that particular authorization prior to construction, right? So if the permitting process is estimated to take 6 to 12 months, because that's how long it takes to gather the data, do the calculations, prepare the application. Maybe the state has a big backlog and they're going to end up spending a couple months on it. And then maybe the type of permit that you're going for requires public notice, et cetera, so on and so forth. Consider the timing. It could be a couple weeks depending on what authorization mechanism. It could be almost a year. Location, talked about attainment. Consider that when you're siting for a new facility or you're already located in a non-attainment or attainment region or county. That will change both what your emission levels can be for different authorization mechanisms, and it'll also introduce different applicable regulations depending on where you're located. For example, here in Texas, in Harris County, non-attainment, there are additional regulations for control of VOCs and NOx that come into play, and then others as well, because of the status of this county, where the state is trying to implement additional controls to try and manage the emissions. Sensitive receptors, if your permitting mechanism has some sort of distance limitation, you want to take that into consideration. If you're introducing a new source, there might be 100-foot or 500-foot distance limitation that you need to consider close to sensitive receptors. Of course, we want to look at the emissions. I mean, that's what most people really think about when they think about air permitting, is what are the emissions and how do we calculate those emissions. We first want to look at the usage rate for what raw materials that you're using, or materials in general, and use that combined with any testing results that you might have for your process. Maybe you've had the company come in and test it. Maybe it's an engine and you have some stack testing results. And the like. We might also be able to use manufacturer specifications for something like an engine, manufacturer guaranteed emissions. Otherwise, we would look to publications like AP42, which is a set of emission factors for different processes that the EPA has developed that we can utilize. Are usually very conservative, and we prefer to use testing results or manufacturer specification. They tend to be more accurate and typically lower. Then we use our engineering calculations and material balance to complete emissions to really understand what our flow levels are. We also want to look at other applicable rules that might come into play from both your state or your region and the federal EPA. Best available control technology might need to be implemented at your site depending on what level of permit you need to obtain or you'll be required to obtain, and you'd want to be able to implement that back prior to completing your construction or even completing your design. And along with a couple other things of measuring contaminants, mass cap and trade. Also look at other federal requirements and regulations that would also impact your operations and potentially your design of your facility, like New Source Performance Standard, MAX, NESHAP, and will you have hazardous air pollutants or HAPs at your site? Go ahead.
So some various permitting mechanisms. As we mentioned before, every state has their own version of this. For simplicity's sake, we are going to use Texas's various permitting mechanisms, but do know that other states follow a very similar structure that goes from some very small, super minor, de minimis sources, and as the emissions increase, they get a little bit more prescriptive. And then require notifications and authorizations. But for the most part, every state has something similar type structure, and I'll throw out a few as we're going through Texas's as a model. So in Texas, we have what is called de minimis sources. So these are listed sources, sources that are considered de minimis. There is a list of sources that's broken up into 4 categories, 74 individual exemptions. And it's a list. It's just each source listed. Then there's also the de minimis rule that is based on material usage and the effects screening level that you can use to determine if your source is considered de minimis. Really negligible sources, as I mentioned. When you are claiming de minimis, you do have to meet all the conditions. There's typically no paperwork, and again, you have to keep records. Demonstrating that your source is indeed de minimis in the event of an inspection. The next level above that is what we call a permit by rule. In other states, such as Michigan, they're called exempted sources. In Minnesota, they're called case by case insignificant. They're called insignificant activities. In Louisiana, they're called case by case insignificant activities. So far and so forth. So in Texas, the permit by rules, we have 21, or they're made up of 21 industry type categories and approximately 108 individual PBRs. These are designed to be used kind of like boilerplate type permits. As part of claiming or registering these, you have to meet all the conditions. Think of these types of standard permits as a box. Either you completely fit in the box, or you don't. You can't be partially in, partially out. You can't partially permit a process using a PBR, and it cannot be used to circumvent permitting. Some PBRs have emission limits. Some of these PBRs you do have to register. The nice thing about registering PBRs is they are then enforceable. Those limitations are enforceable if you're doing something creative by limiting operating hours, or material throughput. Again, these are boilerplate conditions. So on the PBR itself, or the exempted sources, or however your state refers to it, is the conditions are all listed. And again, you either meet them or you don't. The nice thing about these is they also do not expire. You do have to operate as reflected in your determination if you just have this information in file, or if you do register. And you do need to amend it in the event that there are changes and the registration no longer reflects what was represented in the application. Next level above that, we have—
Hey, Vanessa, I have a question on the PBRs to clarify. So what if you have a process that sounds like it should be under one of those PBRs because it's defining different processes, right? But you don't quite meet it. Can you pick a different PBR?
No, you can. No, you can't. It's kind of like you either fit it or you don't. You can't say, oh, 90% of my operation complies with this, but the other 10% doesn't. No, it can. You're either all in or you can't claim it. You then have to go to a case-by-case permit if you don't fit it. It has to be completely in that box.
Perfect.
The next level above that we have is standard permits. We have about 20, in Texas, we have about 20 standard permits. And those vary, they're like oil and gas, certain oil and gas facilities, some pollution control projects, sawmills, concrete batch plants with enhanced controls. There's a number of them, and these are very specific characterized class of facilities. These you do have to register. You do need to you do have to have written approval prior to operation, and these do expire. Something to note with the PBRs is you typically do not need to have written authorization from the agency prior to beginning operations. Sometimes you do have to notify them 10 days in advance. Sometimes you have to notify them after, but it depends on what the PBR states. But with the standard permit, you definitely cannot proceed until you receive written approval. So again, kind of that timing comes into play of how soon you want to get a project started when you're deciding on the appropriate permitting mechanism. Standard permits may also require initial compliance testing, continuous demonstrations of compliance, and public notice. Then the very tippy top is here in Texas, we call them case-by-cases. In other states, they're construction permits, permits to install, or minor source general permits. And these, of course, are what's going on here? Oh, hold on. I had a scroll. Hold on. There you go. Animation. So there's the full shebang. You have a full application. You're subject to BAC. You have agency administrative and technical review, 2 public notices, postings up the site, newspaper has to be available for public comment, modeling, draft conditions, correspondence. Typically takes 6 to 9 months to get a final permit, and then of course these expire. And in addition to having these larger permits, you're now on the radar. It is a lot more flexible. You can permit and represent, with a lot more flexibility. But again, you have a bigger permit now. You're now on the inspection list, and you sometimes do have to have various reporting requirements. So it all depends. Some people avoid larger permits like the plague if they can. Others embrace them again for that operational flexibility.
Vanessa, on the very bottom of that pyramid, it showed negligible sources. Can you give us some examples of what that would be, and how you would tell whether you need that or a PBR? Or
so negligible sources. So if there's a whole list of negligible sources. There's things like
Texas.
Yeah, in Texas there's
state.
Yeah, they vary from state to state, but there's something like beauty shops, right? You have like dryers and beauty shops, swimming pool maintenance, landscaping, food prep, auto detailing, when you're pipeline, like various pipeline activities are included in that. So there's a list. So if it's outside of the list, you can also demonstrate based off of material usage. So I will go in our example, we talked through one of the material use exclusions.
And it says
sometimes they're kind of silly, like barbecue pits, but sometimes they're actually quite useful, like manual application of lubricants. If you're rubbing lubricants with a rag, like that's de minimis. Yay, you don't have to worry about it.
And it says typically no paperwork, but at the same time, you must keep records to demonstrate a minimal sources.
Yeah, so you have to keep them in file. Keep them like in your file. I guess it depends. So again, with the de minimis, you can claim a listed source, or you can use the material rule, or the ESL. So it's specifically when you use those, and you want to demonstrate that you meet the de minimis rule based on material usage, you'd want to kind of keep in file a little memo to file your calculations that were used to determine that you qualify for that de minimis rule.
Okay.
And again, we'll go through, we have an example at the end to show that.
And last,
that paperwork is really for, in the event of an inspection, a regulator comes on site and says, well, what about this process where you apply a lubricant to clean this surface? Where's your permit? And then you say, oh, it's de minimis. Here's the paperwork, the memo I developed for it.
And at the very top, case by case, do you have any examples like what that would seem to be like the toughest of the toughest? Like you're really putting some bad stuff out in the air. Is there any examples that you can? What would that be? An example of that?
They're not necessarily the toughest of the toughest. I mean, the toughest are like more PSD type permits, but this is just if you are emitting more than 25. I should back up. There's various levels of the criteria pollutants. There are certain levels. So for VOCs, to qualify for PBR, it has to be less than 25 tons. To qualify, depending on your area, if you're in an attainment area, if you exceed 100 tons, you are now a Title V. So with that, it's meeting that kind of middle ground of you don't quite qualify for PBR, you're not quite a major source, so then you fall into this other permitting category. Granted, in Texas, you would still need an NSR if you were a major source, but so it just depends on your operations. I mean, if you just have a lot of throughput, if you're using a lot of if you have multiple boilers, you have you're emitting a lot of NOx. If you have a lot of VOCs that you're using in your process that exceeds a PBR, you would need a case by case. It just varies. Oil and gas, if you just have multiple engines running, you have a lot of leaky points. I mean, you potentially trigger a case by case. It just depends. It just depends.
Very good. Thank you. Actually, somebody has a question. Can you have both a PBR and a Title V?
You can. You definitely can. So in Texas, again, it's a two permit system. The PBRs authorize the construction of it. The Title V.
Yeah, they're part of the new source review. The PBRs is under that.
The PBRs, correct. So what we're talking about, and the reason we gave that disclaimer earlier in the presentation is this is strictly like kind of construction. What is authorizing us to be able to construct these sources? And then if you trigger major source, then the Title V authorizes the operation as well. So, so when in Texas, for example, with the PBR, you're claiming this PBR. And so if you have a Title V, you more than likely have an NSR, not more than likely, you definitely have, well, that's not true. There are some for like various standard permits you could not have. Short answer is yes, but they get rolled in, right? So the Title V is kind of it's organizing all the construction authorizations and listing that in the Title V, organizing it that way. But so yeah, it would identify that this facility has a Title V and it's operating in these conditions, and the PBR authorized construction of that particular source at the site. So it's talking about site-wide as a facility property boundary. And that PBR, if it is just for an engine or a boiler, it would identify that in the Title V. I hope that makes sense. I may have kind of talked in circles for that one.
Okay, actually, we have another question. So PBR is just showing compliance then?
I don't.
So for your, I think what you're getting at, the question there is, if it's an unregistered PBR, one that you do not have to submit to the TCEQ, then claiming that PBR is demonstrating compliance. It might behoove you. TCEQ could, in theory, ask for calculations and to demonstrate that you're below that 25 tons per year, but you have to demonstrate with that PBR that you are compliant, and part of it is claiming it, and then depending on the PBR itself, being in compliance with each of those items listed in the PBR and demonstrating that you're compliant.
Yep, and as part of claiming in Texas, at least, a part of claiming that PBR is, going to the agency website, printing out that PBR, keeping it in your file, and saying, for this boiler that is less than 40 MMBTU, we're authorized to operate it and or construct it and operate it because we claim this PBR. And here's our file. Hope that answers your question. If not, shoot us an email and we can clarify to the best of our ability.
All right. So going off of a little bit what Vanessa talked about is beyond the basics of what the regulation requires as far as what your emissions are, how you calculated them, what some additional regulations might require you to do as far as changing your design of your facility, what other considerations do you need to take or might you want to take when you're figuring out your permitting mechanism for your new source, for your modification. So that might be where some client goals and objectives come into play, like operational flexibility, like Vanessa mentioned. So maybe the most important thing for you is to maximize the throughput because you know that your process is going to be wildly popular and take off running, and you want to have maximum amount of flexibility for how much throughput you can have through your facility. So you're going to max that out, knowing that the opposite end of that means that you might have a bigger permit. You might have an NSR, you might even be pushed to a Title V, but it's worth it for you because you want to be able to do whatever you want to do at your site. Or vice versa, maybe you want to avoid a larger permit, and so you're going to restrict your operations so that you don't get pushed into an NSR or a Title V. The start of construction and operations, maybe that needs to occur as soon as possible, and you at least can start up on one piece of it for the construction that needs to happen next month. There might be a permitting mechanism we can find for you so you can do that. Some permit by rules, you can start operation as soon as you've submitted them in the system or to the agency. Other smaller permits might do similar things depending on your region. But that might mean that you can't have the bigger permit because that's going to take 6 to 9 months, maybe up to a year to get that permit. And that's how long you have to wait till you start construction. So you have to minimize your operations so you can get going immediately. Minimal compliance requirements, maybe you're just, you don't have very many people on site. They don't want to have to deal with different types of inspections or sampling activities or calculations or record keeping pieces. And so you want the most basic, the most simple permit possible, knowing that that might, again, cap your operational flexibility. But all these things we want to take into account so we know ahead of time what the best permitting pathway is for you. And it might be not just a one-time thing. It might say, for now, we're going to go permit by rule for this operation that's going to occur over the next 2 years. And then if you decide to expand and grow after 2 years, we can reevaluate. And at that time, maybe we know that you need to go up to a new source review and we can start that process, giving plenty of time to get that mechanism in place.
We have a comment from the audience. Another reminder is also avoiding control equipment. We just had a project recently where a client didn't realize that a control equipment was going to be needed, and they didn't budget for it in this fiscal year. So our goal was to help them stay in compliance with the permitting mechanism, help them restrict their operation so they didn't trigger this requirement for a control device. It's not ideal. It is going to, have a little growing pains for them, but they're willing to take that on to avoid having to get a control equipment right now, since they already have their other equipment on site.
Okay, yeah, very true. And let's see. So now we need to determine the baseline, figure out what our facts are now that we know the client objectives and goals and we're familiar with all the regulations. We need to really know what is happening with this new construction, with this new source or process. So the helpful pieces are a process flow diagram to start with. So overall, what is happening with the entire process? Are there any issues that we're going to see in that process that might impede our action that we wish to proceed with? We want to look at what the affected source is. So what is it? Is it a piece of equipment? Is it a process? Is it an entire activity? Is it one unit? Is it in a building? Is it outside? Is it inside? What are the input rates that you anticipate, that you've seen in years past from other facilities, that you've already pre-calculated yourself to determine how much product you can make, and what are those maximum amounts, or how do you want to cap those numbers? Any safety data sheets for those materials that you're going to be using at your facility. Those are important for us to know, to see what type of chemicals are going to be in there, what their vapor pressures are, so we can understand what type of emissions we might see. Any rates that you know about, we want short-term rates, what's happening hourly, how much of this can happen in an hour, how much of this process can happen in a year. And then what else is happening here? Do we have any control devices on anything? Is there some sort of dust collector or bag house on the particulate matter producing process? Is there something downstream destroying any volatile organic compounds on that process? What do you plan on putting in place, at least for now? From there, similarly, what is the entire process description, so we can understand what happens overall? Do you have any SOPs for that process already in place that we can utilize, or you can utilize for the application? Any equipment OM manuals, so we can pour through it and understand what that piece of equipment is really doing, what happens at each stage of the process. Emission calculations, using all this data that we've acquired, emission calculations will occur utilizing manufacturer specifications, testing results, published emission factors, and the rates that have been provided. What are our short-term hourly rates? What are our long-term annual rates of mass of different pollutants emitted? And then also always typically required is a figure of the site map. Where is everything in relation to each other? Are there any property boundaries that we can identify? And how can we be specific as to the actual point of each emission?
Hey, Sally, I have I was doing multiple things at the same time, so there was a question.
Sure.
And I don't know if it was already asked, because I know Vanessa had a comment from the audience. Can we have multiple facilities under PBRs as long as we are below major source criteria requiring an NSR?
Wait, say that again. I missed the beginning.
Okay. Sorry. Can we have multiple facilities under PBRs as long as we are below major source criteria requiring an NSR?
Gotcha. So that's another topic. We did discuss it a little bit earlier, but you can have, you will probably need to have multiple PBRs at a fully functioning site to cover all the different types of operations that you have. And you might, try to get PBRs as opposed to a new source review case-by-case permit. And you can do that as long as your site-wide totals remain under that threshold per criteria pollutant, so 25 tons per year for VOCs. And if there is a concern or a request, you can always submit something to the state to say, yes, we have 10 PBRs, but if you put them all together, all the emissions, all the VOCs remain under 25 tons per year. But that is something important to look at. You don't want to stack your PBRs to the point where you're not compliant anymore and you're potentially circumventing the law, and something that you'd want to evaluate, even if they are smaller sources. You want to keep those records in place. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So now we're going to take our facts and figures, meets, goals, and objectives, and throw a couple scenarios at y'all. So a small metal parts manufacturer, and real quick back up. The reason we chose, there's going to be some surface coating examples. the reason we chose surface coating because that seemed to be pretty consistent across all the states. They all have various types of surface coating standard permits in significant activities. And also it's just easy mass balance math. We're not going to do any major or any, having to reference AP42 emission factors or do any, crazy engineering calculations. So hence why we chose surface coating. So a small metal parts manufacturer located in an attainment area currently outsources coating operations. They are looking to grow the business by offering repair services to a select few original parts customers. After the repairs are completed, some coating touch-up will be needed. Approximately half a pint of paint is used per repaired part. Currently, the select customers are looking to contract a combined 20 parts per week. Minimal solvents will be used and is not expected to exceed 50 gallons of use per year. Does the small metal parts manufacturer require air authorization? Definitely. You're using solvents, you're emitting VOCs, so you definitely need some sort of air authorization. Where do we begin? First, here is the list of de minimis sources. So we're just going to scroll through that. Does not look like that activity is included in the listed sources. However, there is as we mentioned earlier, the material rule. So for facilities or sources at a site which in combination with the following materials do not exceed the below, right there, item B, coatings excluding plating materials, 100 gallons per year. So if we do not exceed 100 gallons per year, we are good to claim the de minimis rule, as well as cleaning and stripping solvents being used not to exceed 50 gallons. So going back to the information that was provided to us by our small metal parts manufacturer, they'll be using 0.5 pints of coating per repaired part, 20 parts per week, 52 weeks per year, 1 gallon, 8 pints are in 1 gallon. So right now, with the looks of it, they will not exceed 100 gallons per year. So we're good. Put it in our file it away. Scenario 2. Fast forward a year, same small parts metal manufacturer is looking to build efficiencies and increase turnaround times. In an effort to meet those goals, they are considering greatly reducing and ideally eliminating any production outsourcing, which includes coating. Management wants to accomplish this sooner than later, yesterday, as they like to say. I feel like I got that a lot when I was in industry. The production goal is 100 parts per week with every part needing to be coated. Based on third-party vendor information, a maximum of 5 gallons of coating is used to coat the part. They will continue to use the same coating the supplier has used. The coating does not require thinning, and spray guns will be used for application. Cleaning solvent will be used to clean the guns and paint lines. So is this a deviation from the de minimis operations that we were previously conducting? Definitely. Previously, they were just doing some small touch-up to repairs. Now they're talking about doing full-on coating operations with an output of 100, with coating 100 parts per week. So how much? So just to compare what we were previously at to where they want to go, now we'll be using 5 gallons coating per part, 100 parts per week, 52 weeks a year. We are now up to 26,000 gallons to be used in a year, which far exceeds the 100 gallons per year de minimis material rule. So it does not work out. Now, what do we have? What are we looking at? We go back to what is our baseline. So we use any available information. So we have the environmental data sheets for the coating that the supplier said that they were previously using. They said you don't thin, but they're going to need cleaning. It's going to require obviously cleanup for the paint lines. We can find that type of information since the manufacturer didn't previously do this operation. They're kind of needing help trying to identify, well, what thinner, what solvent is going to be, not thinner, solvent, cleanup solvent is going to be used. So we go and look at manufacturer recommendations, and that is found in the different application bulletins, product information. We see that MEK is the suggested cleanup solvent. We get the environmental data sheet or EDF for MEK, and then also, since hopefully, we're growing, but we're not quite that big. We don't have, the dedicated resources to have a full-on environmental person. So we would like to stay in the PBR realm. So we have here a site map of our operations where the proposed paint booth will go. So before we even get into that, we want to do just a quick potential to emit check to ensure we're not going to hit major source. So take our coating. We have 5 gallons of coating per part. The VOC content of the product that we're looking at is 1.16 pounds. It takes about half an hour to coat. There's 60 hours in a year, convert that to tons, and we're looking at about 50 tons per year of VOC. Throw in the cleaning solvent, we're looking at 0.3, 51.1 tons. Total VOC being emitted is less than the 100 tons that would trigger major source, so we're good. However, PBRs are based on actuals, not potential to emit. So when we look at how many parts we're looking to output, which is 100, it would cost 15.08 tons, and that coupled with the cleaning solvent is less than 25 tons. So we are able to claim PBR, the general PBR. We fall into the general PBR rule, and then we are able to claim the surface coating PBR. Now that's just from the total annuals. There are other conditions that we have to consider, which are the hourly emissions, stack height, distance to offsite receptors, boost velocity, et cetera. And again, that is where that baseline information or that kind of data that we were talking about earlier comes into play to ensure that we are meeting all those other conditions. To reiterate, if you don't meet the conditions that are listed in that boilerplate type PBR, you can't claim it. But just based off of quick math, 1.16, it takes half an hour to clean to coat. If we did it for an hour, we would be below the 6 pounds per hour. Fast forward even farther, another year. Same small parts metal manufacturers really booming. All coating has been moved in-house, potentially adding another paint line and booth, 2 lines per booth. Increased production throughput to 250 parts per week. Additionally, one customer has requested a specialty paint that has a higher VOC content of 3.4 pounds of VOCs per gallon. Management, again, wants to start yesterday and does not want the burden of a bigger permit. Again, gather all our information to see, okay, where does this project put us? We know the timing. The management said they wanted it yesterday. Again, product information, application, EDS, property map. We'll do our quick potential to emit check again. Based off of that high VOC coating, using max hours of 8760, we are at 148 tons per year of VOCs. Definitely a warning, red flag. If we did it based on actuals, also exceeding the production, using production-based numbers, we are still exceeding that major source threshold. So what happens now? Well, now we have to have a come to goodness discussion with management of this is just not feasible without some concessions. Maybe we do some operational restrictions on the number of parts coated with the higher VOCs. Maybe we do only 30% of parts with that, 30% of parts with that VOCs, and the remainder of that lower VOCs, or go even lower. We install a pollution control device, or we obtain a bigger permit. With PBRs, when you're registering, again, those are federally enforceable. So if we decide to do those operational restrictions, we are protected from needing that larger Title V by ensuring that and restricting ourselves to this operation. Again, some people can live with that. Some people they want to, blow and go, want to have that flexibility to, interchange between that higher content coating, lower content coating, production just going 24/7. So they would potentially decide, what, let's just go for the bigger permit. So that's our examples.
Well,
hopefully I didn't run through those too quickly.
Well, first I wanted to say the animation on your slides is top notch. I mean, that is a new level of sophistication on our webinar. Well, we do have a couple of questions, but I tell you what, we're going a little bit over, so I'm going to make sure that we get your questions answered by email, if that's okay with you guys. And so, but great webinar, a lot of great information. We had some great participation with the audience, which I greatly appreciate. And so I just wanted to say thank you to Vanessa and Sally for putting in the time to do this. It takes a lot of time to put together an hour presentation. So I thank you, ladies, greatly. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Lance.
So, and so I think we have some contact information on the next slide. If you guys have any questions or want to reach out to Vanessa or Sally, there's their contact information. And something that I didn't do, which I normally do, but again, we're kind of out of our element, and we are running a little bit behind. But next month's webinar is on petrochemical development and dredging permitting challenges. Usually I have a slide on that, but it totally slipped my mind. But that's on April 23rd, and you can register that on our website. So anyway, thank you guys for joining us today. Thanks, Sally and Vanessa, and just everybody stay safe.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Yes,
Thank you.
Just everybody stay safe out there, and it's a crazy time, but if we do what we're being asked to do by staying home, we'll get through this very quickly. So you guys have
just let us know if we can help with any compliance needs while a lot of people are being asked to stay at home. We're here.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.